unmute there. Good morning, folks, and thank you all so much for coming out to the second of our live Q&As for our Age of Upheaval series with Dr. Peter Harris. For the next 20 minutes or so, Peter and I are going to be running through some of the great questions that you submitted to us in response to our second lecture. Before we begin, I want to quickly remind you that if you're planning to stick around for our live Q&As at 11 a.m. with Shinan Govani or at 11:30 a.m. with Laura Carlson, you're going to need to refresh your browser at each of those times. So just click on the URL at the top of your screen and hit enter or return at 11 or 11:30. I also want to remind you all that we are recording these Q&As right now, so you'll be able to watch them at a later date, and I'll be sending a link to all of you in my email on Monday with the recorded version of this Q&A in case you want to check it out later, or you have any friends or family members who are not able to join us right at this moment. In the meantime, though, I'm really excited to dig into these great questions, and I want to ask you all to join me in giving a warm and curious minds welcome to our fearless leader, Dr. Peter Harris. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. Nice
Always
to be back here.
Always great to connect with you on Friday mornings. I want to dive right into our questions because we got quite a high volume of really interesting questions in response to Lecture 2, where you really skillfully navigated us through the world of New York in the 1920s and these sort of three distinct trends of the women's suffrage movement, the Great Migration of African Americans, and then finally the theme that our first questioner wants to hear more about, and that's prohibition. So Diane Smith in Collingwood writes that she really enjoyed this week's lecture and that it brought her back to the time of The Untouchables, the great Brian De Palma film of the late 1980s with Kevin Costner that looks at sort of the Prohibition era in America. And she wants just a little refresher here to kick things off. Why and how did Prohibition come into being, and how long did it last?
Okay, yes, Diane, thank you very much for that question. It's really an interesting and protracted process how Prohibition came along. It didn't just appear out of the blue in 1919 when it was initially passed. In fact, they had been agitating for it through the earlier part of the 20th century. And it did pass in 1919, and it started to be enforced in January of 1920. And it, of course, required going through the federal government first and then ratification by the different states. And you might wonder, well, with all the attention about the suffragette movement in 1920, how did people have time for this Prohibition amendment? Because the basic impulse behind the Prohibition had been the large numbers of drunkenness and alcohol addiction overwhelmingly among men through the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. And there was very little in the way of social welfare to pick up all the shattered homes that presented. So I can't think of the exact reference where I found this, but the suffragettes, quite wisely, I thought, said to the people promoting Prohibition, look, we'll vote for you, we'll get out the vote for you if you'll get out the vote for us. Because the suffragettes and the prohibitionists both knew that the publication of the census figures in 1920, and I alluded to that in my second lecture about New York City, but that was going to show that for the first time, urban population was greater than rural population. And of course, that census is used to determine number of seats in Congress. And so the people wanting Prohibition wanted to make sure it passed before the census came out and started changing representation in the federal government. So they agreed they'd support the suffragette movement, they would support Prohibition, They both came out and as of 1920. And Prohibition actually lasted in the United States till 1933. It was repealed finally at the end of 1933. And you might ask, well, was it a success? Yes and no. You saw probably in that clip that ended the second lecture that people flocked to speakeasies, and that there were estimates that there were 100,000 of them across the United States, and a lion's share of those being in New York City. So it was somewhat of a success, but also somewhat of a failure. And that movie you referred to, Diane, the Untouchables, you of course side with Kevin Costner and his band of untouchable agents cracking down on the corruption of Al Capone. Well, the fact is, anyone who was having a drink in a speakeasy, and it was thousands upon thousands, they were breaking the law. And people loved drinking in those places because that added an extra little frisson to it all. Hey, we're having a great time in this speakeasy and we're breaking the law at the same time. We're happy outlaws. So that was a 13-year period that was let's say an interesting part win, part lose era in American history.
Mhm. So Peter, shifting gears from Prohibition to some of the interesting linguistic trends in New York in the 20s that you outlined at the beginning of your lecture this week. Annie English writes in to ask if you had any good etymology or origin stories regarding what led to some of these phrases.
Yes, Annie, thank you. That's also a really interesting question. And Will, you had tipped me off there was going to be something about those phrases that I substituted instead of going into comparisons with COVID-19 and Spanish flu and so on. Well, I talked about that last time, and let's not get depressed by going into that again. Well, those phrases, I mean, lots of things were loosening up in society. Women's clothing, women's deportment, the sense of class, those were all being tossed aside as pre-war constricting values. And so people felt they could not only play with the laws, but they could play with the language. And so there were a series of wonderful expressions, and I'll just mention a couple of them, like the bum's rush. Well, bums were bums back in the 1920s. That is a homeless person begging on the streets, and they were in fact a factor in pre-World War I society in New York too. And many of these guys used to come in to the free snacks at the bars, particularly in some of the hotels in New York City, using it as a kind of soup kitchen. Well, those began to fall out of favor at the end of World War I, and the hotels realized that this wasn't just their customers they were catering to. These bums kept wandering in and trying to scoop up the free food on offer. So they were given by the bouncers the term which the bouncers themselves coined, called the bum's rush, where you grab these bums, one hand on the nape of his neck, the shirt collar, and the other hand by the seat of the pants. I guess that's a double meaning of bum there. And they were summarily ushered out the door and ejected onto the sidewalk, let's say forcefully. And one of the other expressions that always fascinated me there was the bee's knees. I mean, how many of us have actually looked up close at a bee's knee? But it means this is terrific, this is great. And so expecting that somebody might ask about that, I looked up a little more detail on it. And another expression that was used in the same way was the cat's pajamas. Not too many cats wearing pajamas either. But in fact, there was a whole bunch of phrases like that where you take an animal or something live, and then usually that had an honorable sense to it, and parrot was something totally incongruous. So it had a nice kind of satiric incongruity to it. And I just want to read you a few of those. I find these quite fascinating. Maybe you can work some of them into your conversation. Who knows? So besides the bee's knees and the cat's pajamas, here are some of the ones that were current in the 20s and fell by the wayside, maybe sadly. The elephant's adenoids, the ant's pants, and here's a particularly ornate one, the caterpillar's kimono, the gnat's elbows, and probably my favorite of these is the oyster's earrings. But another couple, the clam's garter, the eel's ankle, and the kipper's knickers. And of course, this is delightful play with language. And we do that kind of doubling now too. Expressions like itsy bitsy and artsy fartsy and teeny weeny, probably reaching some kind of zenith or nadir, depending on your point of view, in the itsy bitsy teeny weeny yellow polka dot bikini of the 50s. Anyway, lots of interesting etymologies behind many of those phrases. I hope that gives you a taste to go look up some of the other ones on your own.
All right, moving on to sort of the third strand in your lecture this week, the Great Migration of African Americans to New York City. Thomas writes in to ask how this great migration changed New York politics and US politics in general. Did the influx of new Black voters affect who was getting elected to office? Or did African Americans continue to face political challenges in the North?
I sort of lost you at the end there, Will, but because your Wi-Fi started acting up. But yes. I get the gist. I get the gist. And okay. I wish I had a better answer to this really intriguing question, because the Harlem Renaissance, where so many Blacks were concentrated and produced that absolute flourishing Renaissance in the cultural areas, well, there was certainly some political activity too, but I can find so far no records of Black politicians from that area or elsewhere in the city being elected into the governing structure of New York City, or indeed of it having any effect on statewide or federal politics. And I've checked various sources for this, the Smithsonian, the African American Museum. I mean, there certainly was an interest in one political strand. Marcus Garvey, who was active at that time, was promulgating a return to Africa, to Liberia, to the free state of Liberia for Blacks, because he was convinced they would never achieve equality in the United States, but he got deported for his efforts. And I continued to look, as were there Black politicians? So I'm going to just give part one of my answer here. I suspect not a lot, because after all, the Blacks continued, even with that heavy in-migration to Harlem, continued to be a pretty small part of the overall population of New York City. By 1930, they were still considerably less than 5% of the total population of New York City. And in many of those boroughs, like Staten Island in particular, they were like 1%. So their vote would have just been kind of lost in the general voting trends. But I hope I can find something more concrete about that. I'll stop with that for now.
Okay, to be continued. an interesting question on immigration. Roseanne writes, I've heard America's response to immigration typically described as past immigration is good, but present immigration is bad. Did nativism in the 1920s result in immigrant groups sticking together in New York City, or did they attempt to migrate to more accepting parts of the country?
Yeah, this is also an intriguing question. Well, a few stabs at that. For one thing, the Immigration Acts that I discussed of 1921 and 1924 severely lowered the immigration of all those areas that the nativists wanted diminished in the immigration count. And that was from Eastern Europe and particularly from Asia, from China. So the 1924 Act basically said no Chinese. And it also cut down severely on, well, I took as my example, Italian immigrants. And did this mean they stuck together? Well, it's hard. The Italian immigrants settled New York, Pennsylvania, along the East Coast. There was an incident I didn't mention about the brutal beating and murder of some Italian Americans in New Orleans in the midst of all that nativist uproar. So the populations declined, and also the immigration populations declined, but also the as happens in immigrant communities, people moved on. Some Germans moved from the lower village. They were in between Avenue A and Avenue B, and there was a horrible ferry boat sinking in which many of them were killed, over 1,200 killed on the General Slocum. So they moved up to Germantown, up on the Upper East Side. And then also some of them went on to Milwaukee, which was a famous brewing town, and some of the architecture in Milwaukee, old architecture in downtown Milwaukee looks like a North German city. So there was pockets of that, but some of them also stayed in New York. So there isn't a single answer to that interesting question.
All right. So Peter, we're nearing the end of our time here. So I want to jump ahead to a really interesting theme that you drew out in this week's lecture that Cheryl Steinberg wrote in about. You made the really interesting point that the 19th Amendment and the movement for women's suffrage was part of a wider cultural movement that led to the emergence of the flappers. Was there a version of the flappers in Berlin and Paris? And was there a comparable political movement in either country that contributed to this new cultural sensibility and aesthetic?
Okay, let me say first off that in my fourth lecture, I talk quite specifically about that. So I don't want to upstage myself too much, but I will say that yes, there were comparable movements, particularly in Berlin. And well, I hope build anticipation for that fourth lecture by saying that the wave of interest in America, Americanismus, delight in things American, is this new fresh breath of air replacing the stuffy imperialism of pre-World War I. Well, that appeared in the form of music, of touring black bands. We've seen that with Josephine Baker, and with a flood of movies from the United States, because by the mid-20s, the American movie industry was in high gear. And you're going to see clips from The It Girl, Clara Bow, and a couple of others which played big time in Berlin, and that brought the costumes and the music to Berlin. Yes, there was also that movement in Paris because, as I mentioned in the first lecture, Montmartre, Paris Noir, was one of the hotspots of Paris nightlife, and that was also bringing that music and that flapper outfits, aided quite strongly by Coco Chanel with her post-World War I designs, which were moving sort of in sync with what was happening in flapper outfits in the United States. So stay tuned for lecture 4.
All right. Well, something to look forward to for sure. But in the meantime, a very interesting question from Cheryl, really drawing out one of the fascinating themes you touched on in this week's lecture, Peter, because I think sometimes maybe there's a distinction we draw in our mind between the sort of very noble, righteous movement for women's suffrage and then this somewhat frivolous image that's attached to the flappers. But you drew a fascinating connection to show how this cultural aesthetic movement was related to this really earth-shaking political movement.
Yes. Well, I wanted to make sure that people could see that connection between the suffragette movement, which of course resulted in the flappers and the still wildly sexy outfits that the women were wearing in the 1920s. But there was also a broader sense of movement in women's lives in the 1920s when the suffragette movement didn't just go away with the passage of that amendment. They began to agitate for women to make sure they voted, and they worked hard at ensuring that women were apprised of their rights and set up campaigns down to the local levels, ensuring that women would come out and vote for some candidates. Now, there wasn't a great uptake in numbers of women being elected into statewide and federal offices, but it was a beginning. It was interrupted by the 30s, as we will see, but that came roaring back again, particularly by the 1950s. So this was laying some foundation, and the superstructure wasn't quite apparent yet.
Right. Okay. Well, to be continued in our subsequent lectures. I'm afraid that's all the time that we've got for this week. But Peter, I want to thank you again for taking the time to join us. And we look forward to connecting with you again next week, June the 5th at 10:30 a.m. to answer folks' questions on lecture 3, which is going to look at science and technology. I'll be sending you all an email on Monday as soon as that lecture has been posted online. So Peter, thanks so much.
Well, I just want to get in a quick thank you to all the watchers in the audience for those questions that you sent in. They really are quite engaging for me to follow up and see where interest points are for you in what I've been babbling on about. So I look forward to more.
All right. Well, thank you again, Peter. Have a wonderful weekend.